This is a video about rhetorical appeals. So Aristotle identified 3 modes of persuasion or rhetorical appeals that can be used in your own arguments or that you can identify when you're analyzing somebody else's argument: logos, pathos, and ethos. So logos you can think of as the text itself or the word of the text. It actually means the logic or the word of the text. Obviously, that's going to be hugely important in academic writing. Pathos has to do with emotion or experience or feeling. Think of pathos as the audience's feeling about a text or about a speech. Then there's ethos, which has to do with the writer's credibility, the writer's ethics or character. So this has to do, or it lines up with the writer. So one way that you might think of this is logos as text or logic, pathos as emotion or feeling having to do with how the audience interacts with the text, and ethos as the credibility of the writer. And these are sometimes referred to as the rhetorical triangle. Let's zoom in a little bit on logos. So logos is an appeal to reason. And when you're using logos in your own essays or when you're analyzing how other writers appeal to logic, you might consider the use of inductive reasoning. That's when you have a specific case, and from that representative case, if it is indeed a representative case, you draw a generalization, so you move outward, or deductive reason, which is where you move from the generalization to focusing on a specific case from that generalization. Aristotle identified different types of arguments. There's artistic proofs and inartistic proofs. An artistic proof is created or constructed by the writer or the rhetorician or the speaker. So things like analogies or hypothetical examples, syllogism, those would be examples of artistic proofs. Inartistic proofs are things that are given to the writer or the rhetorician or the speaker. So just hard data without the analysis, testimony, primary source documents, things like that would be considered inartistic proofs. With logos, it's important to have logical clarity to make sure that your argument makes logical sense and is logically sound, and make sure that it's consistent. Let's take a look now at pathos. So this is an emotional appeal. You can see how this can be really effective, but if you go overboard or if the writer goes overboard, it can become kind of saccharine, it can turn people off, it can actually backfire in some cases, or it has the power to be really manipulative and not in a good way. It can be unethical if you are manipulating or tugging at people's heartstrings to misrepresent something. So you have to be careful with pathos. Interviews. Now, interviews could be logos, but they could also be pathos if they are incredibly poignant. Personal stories, vivid scenarios or descriptions, and humor. And humor, a lot of these have overlap. Humor can also be used to establish the writer's credibility or ethos. Typically, it's not used so much in logos, but there's some overlap here between pathos and ethos. Let's talk now about ethos. The ethical appeal has to do with the writer's credibility. Why should we believe this writer? Why is the writer an authority? And depending upon the type of essay you're writing, or depending upon the type of text that you're analyzing, the author might show credibility by referencing credentials or referencing why the writer is an expert in that particular field. It might even be something like the format of the text, using the correct format, like APA or MLA format, knowing how to cite sources correctly, summarizing other sources correctly and not misrepresenting other people's arguments. That can also build up the writer's ethos, because people will say, oh, this person is credible, they understand the writing conventions in this genre, they know how to cite sources, they're not misrepresenting things. So even something like format can be an appeal to ethos. Also, humor or just likability. When the author is self-deprecating, there are actually times when that can be a really effective appeal to ethos, because it makes you think, oh, this person is willing to be self-deprecating or look at themselves critically. When the writer talks about personal experience, if that personal experience has to do with what the writer is talking about or what the writer is arguing, they have their own firsthand experience, that can help establish the writer's credibility and reliability. So it kind of depends on your audience and what type of text you're writing or what type of text you're analyzing. But it really does come down to the writer's credibility, authority, likability, and maybe most importantly, that the writer or rhetorician has clear and unselfish motives. We're not going to trust somebody who has some sort of ulterior motive, right? Especially if it's a political piece or an academic piece or a scientific piece. If we know that they are bought and paid for by a company, then we might be skeptical. Let's talk briefly about the rhetorical situation. So we never write or make arguments in a vacuum. Just like a child asking their mother or father for like a cupcake or a treat knows that you have to ask at the right time, right? When they're not too grumpy, when it's not the end of the day, when they're most willing to give you that cupcake or that treat. We all know that there is the right time and a right place to make any sort of argument. So when you're making arguments, you also want to think about the context. And there's so much we could talk about with context, but context means the time period, the social climate, the atmosphere, the time of day, what's just happened the day before, what's going on politically, right? There's so much having to do with context. One term that we can use comes from mythology, Kairos, who was the son of Greece and the god of opportunity. Kairos is the best time and place in which to make an argument and the best way to express it. So an argument that Reagan gave about tearing down the Berlin Wall, or an argument that Michelle Obama gave at the Democratic National Convention about electing Joe Biden, those arguments were timed, right? There were things that were going on in terms of the historical and political context, which makes their timing, depending upon who you ask, right. So think about the rhetorical situation when you're writing your own arguments and how you can change your argument or change your own essay because of the context in the rhetorical situation. And also think about the rhetorical situation when you're analyzing somebody else's argument. So the rhetorical situation, that's the circumstances in which you communicate. There's always a rhetorical situation. Think about the writer, the purpose, the audience, the topic, the context, and the culture.